I don't care what that paper says, you are trespassing.
This is a binding agreement. You need to honor the terms immediately.
As the new owner, I'm exercising the default clause in your contract.
You can't be serious. This is highly irregular. It's binding.
The officers are here to ensure a smooth transition.
You need to leave right now, or they will arrest you for trespassing. I am not signing this contract. I am telling you for the last time, you have no authority here. Get out of my store.
Actually, as of this moment, I own the building. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate.
I need them here right now. She is refusing to leave the premises, and I have a store to run.
Yes, hurry, please.
I don't care what you think, and I need authorization right now. The police are here, and I am not signing this contract without approval. Fine, do what you want. I don't care what it says, you need to get down here now. She's refusing to leave.
I am simply asking you to honor the terms of this agreement.
I don't care what they said, you need to get down here now. She's leaving.
We had a deal. I suggest you review the terms of the contract I just signed.
Wait, stop. You can't just take that and walk out.
Sorry, what?
Looks like she has a signed contract, man. It's out of our hands.
The contract is signed. The store is officially mine.
You can't do this.
It's already done.
It wasn't supposed to be like this. A soft jingle above the door barely registered in the quiet of the shop as Jada stepped inside. She'd hoped for something calm, just a few minutes to grab a couple of office supplies. The store wasn't crowded. Just a few customers, the smell of fresh paper, and the hum of fluorescent lights. But something in the air felt off. Behind the counter, a white store manager, Tom, looked up and his eyes flickered. Just for a second, but it was enough. He did not greet her, not even a polite nod. She shrugged it off, pretending not to notice. She walked down the aisle, picked out a pack of pens. As she headed toward the counter, she noticed the soft murmur of Tom's voice, like he was talking to someone on the phone. Then the words hit her. Yeah, it's her. The black woman in the blue dress. Can you send someone down? I think she's trying to steal something. The words cut through her like a slap to the face. She froze. Her heart began to race as she tried to make sense of it. Did he really just say that? She hadn't done anything wrong, nothing to even suggest that he'd think she was stealing. But the words were already out there, and it was too late. A flash of panic crossed her mind as the store's door opened behind her. Was it a cop? Excuse me, ma'am, Tom said, a cold smile creeping across his face. Can I see your bag? Jada's chest tightened, but she straightened her back. She wasn't about to let this slide. Not this time. Jada walked into the store, the cool air conditioning brushing against her skin as the door jangled behind her. She adjusted the strap of her handbag and scanned the aisles filled with office supplies. It was an unassuming space. Rows of pens, notepads, binders, and shelves of printer paper. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a steady hum in the background, soothing yet mundane. She was only there for a quick stop, something to help her get through another busy week at work. Her office had a small budget for supplies, and she liked to pick up the things she needed herself. Pack of pens, a new notebook, maybe a few highlighters. Simple. Her heels clicked lightly against the floor as she moved down the aisle, selecting the pens she liked. She glanced up to see the manager behind the counter. Tom, she remembered. His name tag barely readable against the dull lighting. He was on the phone, speaking in quiet tones, his back turned to her. Jada moved towards the counter, eyes scanning the other customers in the store. No one seemed to be paying attention, and she could feel the exhaustion of the day creeping in. Another long meeting, another stressful deadline. But then, without warning, she overheard his words. Yeah, it's her. The black woman in the blue dress. Can you send someone down? I think she's trying to steal something. Jada froze. The words hung in the air for a long, disorienting moment. She blinked, her pulse quickening. Her hand, still clutching the pens, tightened. Did he just say that? She stood still for a few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. She was certain she hadn't heard him right. It wasn't possible. Her mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe he was talking about someone else. But the more she tried to rationalize, the more her stomach churned with a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just an ordinary situation. This wasn't a misunderstanding. He was talking about her. A sharp coldness settled into her chest. Jada took a deep breath, but it felt shallow, tight. She looked around the store again. No one had noticed. Not yet. She could feel the weight of his gaze from across the room, even though he wasn't looking at her directly. His words echoed in her mind, and the silence of the store grew deafening. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, trapped in her own thoughts, before the sudden jangle of the door interrupted her spiraling panic. A uniformed officer stepped inside. Jada swallowed, her throat dry. She turned back to Tom, who was watching her now, a calculated smile on his face. It wasn't a smile of politeness. It was something colder, something deliberate. "Excuse me, ma'am," Tom said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Can I see your bag?" Jada's hand clenched around the handles of her purse, her body tensing. Her mouth went dry, and her heart hammered against her chest. She had done nothing wrong, nothing at all. Yet here she was, in the middle of the store, about to be accused. Her mind flashed back to the moments before, when Tom had picked up the phone, when she had first heard those words. The black woman in the blue dress. Her hand trembled as she set the pens down. It wasn't just about the pens. It wasn't just about the store or the items. It was everything. This moment. This small, terrible moment that had turned into something much bigger. She took another breath, louder now, willing herself to stay calm. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the sting of indignation at the very idea that she had to explain herself. "No," she said, her voice low but clear. "I'm not showing you anything." Her eyes locked onto Tom's, steady and unflinching. The officer shifted behind her, the air thickening with tension. The world around her seemed to slow. "Excuse me," Tom said, his voice a little sharper now. Jada stepped forward, her back straight. She wasn't going to let him control the narrative, not this time. "I am not a thief," she said, her voice gaining strength. "And I will not be humiliated here." The officer didn't move. Neither did Tom. For a moment no one spoke. The fluorescent lights above flickered, as if even the store itself could feel the weight of the situation. And then the door opened again. The officer, standing at the threshold, glanced to the side. Another officer. Was this it? Was this how it was going to happen? Jada took another step forward, forcing herself to stay composed, her pulse thumping louder in her ears. But then, just as the officer turned, she spoke again, her voice low but firm. "You're not calling the cops on me." Tom's smile faltered. "I have every right to." I said no. And for a moment the world felt entirely still. The store was suffocating in silence. Tom's smile was gone now, replaced with a tense frown that tugged at his lips. The officer at the door remained still, unsure, eyes flickering between Jada and Tom. He had yet to speak, still holding his position as if he were waiting for something. An order, perhaps. But Jada could feel his hesitation. Tom cleared his throat. "I said, ma'am, I need to see your bag. If you've done nothing wrong, you shouldn't have an issue." Jada's chest tightened. This wasn't just about the bag anymore. It wasn't about pens or office supplies. It was about control, humiliation, and the power dynamics that loomed over her with every word Tom spoke. "I'm not showing you anything," Jada said again, her voice stronger this time. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm here as a customer." Behind her, the hum of the fluorescent lights grew louder, like an accusation in itself, echoing in her skull. She could feel eyes on her now, the other customers, the officer, even Tom, watching, waiting to see what she'd do next. Her heart raced, but she didn't show it. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was calm, too calm. If she let herself go, if she let the anger take over, she might do something she would regret. A soft shuffle sounded behind her, followed by a gentle voice. "Ma'am, can I speak with you for a moment?" Jada's head snapped around. It was the black officer, Marcus. He wasn't the one who had come in first, but he was standing close now. His expression wasn't exactly friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It was the look of someone who had seen this before, someone who understood the fragile nature of moments like these. "Excuse me," Marcus said, stepping aside with a slight gesture of his hand. "Can I talk to you outside?" "Away from him," he added, nodding subtly toward Tom, who had gone rigid at the officer's approach. Jada didn't move right away. She was torn, her instincts pulling her in two directions. One part of her was screaming to stay firm, to make sure Tom saw she wasn't backing down. But another part of her, an ache she couldn't shake, felt the temptation to let the officer guide her outside. It felt safer, less combative, though in that moment, she knew it wasn't really about safety. It was about keeping control of her narrative. Her eyes remained locked on Tom for a moment longer, daring him to try something else. When he didn't speak, she finally nodded to Marcus and stepped toward him, the tension still hanging thick in the air. The officer led her to the side door, which opened into the back alley of the shopping plaza. The cool evening air hit her, a brief respite from the pressure in the store. She stepped out, Marcus following closely behind. "Ma'am, I can't say much right now," Marcus began, his voice low, as if he feared Tom would hear. "But I'll tell you this. I see it happen too many times. And I'm sorry." Jada's eyes narrowed, her body tense as the words sank in. "You're sorry?" He nodded, his hand brushing across his forehead as he looked away for a moment, like he needed a second to compose himself. "Look, I don't want to make this harder than it already is. I'm just trying to make sure things don't escalate." "Escalate?" Jada scoffed, taking a small step away from him. "Do you even hear yourself? You let him call you down here like I'm some criminal. You didn't even question him. And now, you're standing here telling me you're sorry." Her voice wavered with frustration. She wasn't angry with Marcus. Not entirely. But she was angry with the entire system, with everything that had led her here. "Ma'am, look, I get it," Marcus stammered. "I know this isn't right. But I've got to do my job too. I can't just..." "Just what?" Jada snapped. "Just ignore it. Pretend this doesn't happen every day. You're just gonna go back in there and stand next to him like nothing's wrong, huh?" Marcus hesitated, glancing back toward the store. His silence said more than words ever could. Jada exhaled, pressing a hand to her forehead, fighting the urge to let the tears she'd been holding back fall. "I'm not some criminal. I'm a customer. I came in here for office supplies and I'm being treated like I'm stealing. And you're letting it happen." For a long moment, Marcus didn't respond. The weight of the silence stretched between them. Finally he spoke, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "I know. But there's only so much I can do. I can't just walk away from my job either." Jada stared at him, the realization sinking in. She wasn't going to get the support she needed from him. Not right now, not in this moment. He was part of the system just like Tom. And no matter how much he sympathized with her, there was only so much he was willing to risk. "Just do what you have to do, officer," she said quietly, the bitterness in her words unmistakable. She turned to walk away, not looking back. Behind her, the door to the store creaked open once more. The tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jada didn't look back. Not yet. But she would soon. Soon enough, she promised herself. Jada stepped back into the store with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. The fluorescent lights above seemed brighter now, their buzzing more pronounced, almost accusing. Her heart still hammered in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She wasn't backing down, not today. Not after everything. The officer, Marcus, had stayed behind in the alley, silent in his own struggle. Jada couldn't bring herself to be angry with him, not fully. He was just another cog in the system, doing what was expected of him. But it didn't make her feel any less betrayed. She knew what this was, a pattern, one she had seen too many times in her life. Too many times to let it slide. Tom, standing behind the counter now with his arms crossed, watched her closely. His earlier discomfort had disappeared. Now his expression was blank, professional, but there was a hint of something else behind his eyes, something colder. He had made his move. He had called the police, and in his mind that was the end of it. He gave her a stiff nod as she approached the counter. "I trust everything's been taken care of outside." Jada couldn't help but scoff. "Taken care of? Are you serious?" Tom's smile was tight, forcing itself into place. "You understand, don't you? I can't have people coming in here and—" "Don't," Jada interrupted, her voice low and steady, but the weight of it felt like it could collapse the entire store. "Don't act like this is about procedure. You know exactly why you did it. You called the police because you assumed I was stealing because of the way I look." Tom opened his mouth, but for once, no words came out. It was a brief victory for Jada, a small one, but it didn't feel like enough. She could see the gears turning behind his eyes as he processed what she said, but it didn't stop him from pushing back. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he said, his voice cold. "I need to ensure the safety of my store." Jada felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. She could feel her fists clenching at her sides. She wanted to shout, to let the frustration and humiliation pour out of her, but she knew better. She had to play this carefully. If she lost control, the whole situation would be twisted, turned against her. "Safety?" she asked, her voice a touch louder. "You don't give a damn about safety. You just didn't like the fact that I walked into your store, and you couldn't immediately put me in a box." Tom's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. A beat passed, and she could feel the stares of the other customers in the store, silent witnesses to the whole scene. None of them said anything. It wasn't unusual. No one ever did. The silence was as damning as Tom's actions. "Look," he said after a long pause, straightening up. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air between them like an open challenge. He wasn't asking anymore. He was demanding. And Jada could see the thinly veiled disdain in his eyes. Her body tensed. For a second she considered it. She could walk out, avoid the confrontation and let it slide, maybe file a complaint later. But something inside her refused. She wasn't just going to let him dismiss her like that. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. "Not until you apologize," she said, the words almost catching in her throat as they left her mouth. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the principle of it all, the systemic injustice she had faced for years and was still facing now. Tom narrowed his eyes, the edges of his expression hardening. He wasn't going to apologize. That much was clear. He wasn't going to admit any wrongdoing. And she knew it. "I don't need to apologize," he said flatly. "You're causing a scene. Now I'm asking you to leave, or I'll have to take further action." Jada clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Not now. But as she stood there, facing him, her mind raced. She was being forced out of a store she had a right to be in. The weight of it all, the disrespect, the injustice, the sheer casualness of it, suddenly hit her with a wave of raw emotion. She had been dismissed. She had been seen as less than, as criminal. Her hands were shaking slightly now, but she made sure her voice stayed steady as she spoke again. "I'm not leaving until you do one thing. You tell me that this was wrong. That you made a mistake." Her eyes locked on his, unwavering. "Tell me that you're sorry." For a moment there was silence. Tom didn't speak, didn't move. He stood there, his mouth slightly open, clearly caught off guard by her insistence. But that silence was broken by the sound of the store door jiggling open again. Jada didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She could already feel the presence of someone new walking into the store. The tension in the air thickened. Her voice, steady and unwavering, cut through the silence one last time. "I'm not leaving until you own up to what you've done." And as the new customer walked in, a cold reality settled over Jada. She wasn't just fighting for her right to stay in the store. She was fighting for something much larger: her dignity, her worth, her humanity. Jada spent the rest of the evening pacing in her apartment, trying to shake the feeling of Tom's eyes on her, the suffocating heat of humiliation, the way his words hung in the air like an accusation that refused to go away. It had been hours since the confrontation, but it felt like her chest still tightened every time she thought of it. The echoes of his dismissal, the weight of being treated like she didn't belong, still weighed on her. She couldn't sleep. The injustice kept her up, replaying in her mind like a broken record. He had assumed she was a criminal. Assumed she was guilty simply because of her skin color. It wasn't new, of course. It wasn't even the first time she had been treated unfairly in a public space. But this time felt different. It was rawer, more blatant. She couldn't just let it go. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she searched for the store's social media page. A few clicks later she found it. The small store that had humiliated her in front of everyone. She wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. She started typing, her thoughts flowing faster than she could write. Earlier today, I walked into an office supply store and was accused of stealing, simply because I'm black. When I stood my ground, the manager called the police on me. No apology. No explanation. Just the assumption that I didn't belong. She paused, staring at the screen. The words felt raw, uncomfortable, but necessary. She had nothing to lose. She wasn't just going to let him get away with it. She tapped post, her heart racing. The message had been sent. Within minutes, the responses started flooding in. This is horrible. I've had similar experiences. We need to talk about this. I'm so sorry you had to go through this, but I'm proud of you for speaking out. Racism is alive and well in 2026. This isn't an isolated incident. The more she read, the more she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a while: hope. She wasn't alone in this. Others had experienced the same thing, and they were ready to stand with her. But not everyone was supportive. A few harsh comments surfaced almost immediately. You're just looking for attention. Maybe you should have complied with the police. Are you sure you didn't do something to provoke this? Jada closed her eyes, feeling the sting of the dismissive comments, but she didn't let them stop her. She couldn't. This was bigger than her, bigger than the small incident in the store. This was about a system that treated people like her as less than, as disposable. She couldn't ignore that anymore. The next day, her phone buzzed again. Direct message. She clicked it open. It was from a lawyer, Sandra, who specialized in civil rights cases. Sandra was already familiar with situations like the one Jada had experienced, and she wanted to meet. She'd read Jada's post, and something about it had caught her attention. Jada's heart skipped. Was this really happening? Was she about to take the next step toward holding Tom accountable? She agreed to meet with Sandra the next afternoon. When they sat down, Sandra was calm, professional, and surprisingly empathetic. Her office was filled with books, thick volumes on law, history, and policy, and the soft hum of a printer was the only sound as they spoke. I've seen this before, Sandra said, her voice steady. Stores like that, managers like Tom, they do this all the time. They see black people and they automatically assume the worst. And when we push back, when we demand respect, they double down. I didn't want to cause a scene, Jada admitted, running a hand through her hair. But I couldn't let him get away with it. Sandra nodded. That's exactly why this matters. This is bigger than one store, bigger than one manager. This is about what's happening everywhere. Sandra outlined the legal steps. It wasn't going to be easy, and it was going to take time, but Jada could file a discrimination lawsuit against the store. The case wouldn't just be about her. It would be about the larger issue of systemic racism in everyday interactions, something the store, and by extension the corporate system behind it, couldn't just brush aside. Jada's mind raced. The weight of it all felt heavier now. This wasn't just about justice for her. It was about making sure other black people didn't have to face the same humiliation she had. It was about fighting back. I'll do it, Jada said, her voice firm. I'll take this all the way. I won't stop until something changes. The next few days were a whirlwind. Jada spent hours gathering evidence, photographs of the store, screenshots of the posts on social media, and recordings of the interactions she had with the police and the manager. She shared the story with anyone who would listen. Every conversation felt like a small act of resistance, a step closer to something that could change everything. She was met with some resistance, though. People who accused her of making it up or looking for attention. But there were also those who reached out. Strangers, friends, even people who had witnessed similar events. One afternoon, while scrolling through the comments on a post she had made, she saw a message that made her stomach tighten. It was from a local news outlet, asking if she would be willing to do an interview. They wanted to cover her story. Her heart skipped a beat. This was bigger than just a social media post now. This was going public. She was going to have to face Tom, the police, and the whole world. But even with the fear clawing at her, Jada knew she had made the right choice. This was her moment. She couldn't back down. Jada's fingers hovered over the reply button. She took a deep breath and typed, "Yes, I'll do it." The next morning the news crews arrived. As she stood outside the store with the cameras trained on her, Jada felt the weight of everything she had been holding back. It was time to speak out, to let the world know the truth. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all of them. The ones who had been silenced, ignored, and cast aside. The ones who had been told they didn't belong. She was ready. And this was only the beginning. The first interview was everything Jada had feared. She sat across from the reporter, the camera lights blinding, her palms sweating, but her voice never faltered. She talked about the store, about Tom, about the day that had shifted everything for her. The words came easily, even though her chest felt tight, even though the rawness of it all still stung. And when I asked for an apology, when I stood my ground, I was treated like a criminal. Not just by the store manager, but by the system that he represented, she had said, her voice steady. I wasn't just humiliated in that moment. I was seen as less than. The reporter nodded, listening intently, but she could tell by the way his eyes flickered to the camera that this wasn't just about her. It was about how the story could be shaped, how they could spin it to draw in views. The public wanted drama, but Jada wasn't going to give them that. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to be heard. As the interview ended, the reporter's tone shifted. Jada, we've been hearing a lot of things about this store, about other people who've had similar experiences. Some are saying you might be exaggerating. What would you say to that? Jada took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. I would say that I'm telling the truth. And if that makes people uncomfortable, so be it. But what happened to me happens every day to people like me. We are profiled, we are accused, and when we speak up, we are silenced. The reporter seemed to hesitate before nodding, then quickly wrapping up. The cameras stopped rolling, and Jada felt a mix of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She'd said what needed to be said, but the weight of it all still hung heavy in her chest. The public would have their say, but the real fight was far from over. The next few days were a blur. The interview aired on local news, and the store, now caught in the crosshairs of public scrutiny, issued a statement. They claimed that Tom's actions were an isolated incident, a mistake, and that the store was committed to diversity and inclusion. But the statement felt hollow, scripted. They said the right words, but Jada wasn't fooled. They were only apologizing because they had been forced to, because the spotlight was on them now. The phone calls began flooding in, first from journalists, then from lawyers. Some supported her. Others tried to convince her to settle for an apology and a small payout. But Jada knew that wasn't enough. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't about a check. This was about making a real change. That's when Sandra, the lawyer from the civil rights firm, called. We're ready, Sandra said. We've gathered enough evidence. The next step is to file the lawsuit. Jada paused, her mind racing. And what happens then? The store will have to answer for its actions. We'll be pushing for public accountability, and we'll be demanding that they institute real policies to prevent this from happening again. You won't just be fighting for yourself. You'll be fighting for all the people they've done this to. Jada felt a fire reignite inside her. The fear she had once felt was still there, but now it was something different. It wasn't just fear. It was the push to keep going, to make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. She had to follow through. Yes, she said, the words coming out stronger than she expected. Let's do it. The weeks that followed were filled with paperwork, meetings, and long nights of preparation. Jada stayed focused, but it wasn't easy. The emotional toll of reliving the events at the store, the ridicule, the disbelief from some people, it weighed heavily on her. But there were moments, too, when she found strength in the voices of others. People who shared their own stories of similar experiences, people who reached out to support her. The weight of it felt a little lighter with every new message, every new ally. It wasn't long before the store's public image began to crack. Protests started outside their location. Customers who had been loyal to the store began voicing their support for Jada. The media circus only grew, but Jada was no longer afraid of the spotlight. She knew that the longer the store refused to take responsibility, the more people would see them for what they truly were. An institution built on bias and unchecked power. Tom, the manager, was quietly removed from his position. The store claimed it was due to internal investigations, but Jada knew the truth. His actions had caught up with him. His attempt to wield power over her had backfired in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Still, Jada wasn't satisfied. This wasn't over. Not yet. Sandra called again. We've got a chance for a mediation session next week. The store is offering a settlement. They want to avoid a public trial. Jada sat up straighter in her chair, her fingers drumming against the edge of the table. A settlement, she repeated, her voice thick with disbelief. They want to pay me to go away. Sandra's tone was measured. It's a lot of money, Jada. Enough to make a real difference for you. Jada stood up, walking to the window. The street below was busy, people coming and going. She took a deep breath, her reflection in the glass steady. No, she said finally. I don't want their money. I want justice. I want them to own up to what they've done. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? I'm sure, Jada replied. This isn't about money. It's about making sure they never do this to anyone else. Ever again. The conversation ended soon after, and as Jada hung up the phone, she felt a sense of resolve wash over her. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything she had been through. She was fighting for something bigger than herself. She was fighting for every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong. For every person who had been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. She was ready. The day the lawsuit was filed felt surreal to Jada. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was her declaration of war. The weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. She had taken the first step toward something big, something that couldn't be undone. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all the people who had been targeted, dismissed, and ignored for too long. The news broke within hours. The lawsuit, with its allegations of racial discrimination, was the headline of every local news outlet. The story was picked up by larger platforms, slowly making its way into the national conversation. Jada was thrust into the spotlight, and it felt like everyone was watching, waiting to see if she would crumble under the pressure. Her phone rang constantly. Some calls were from reporters, others from people who shared their own stories of racial profiling, and some from people who didn't believe her, who accused her of looking for attention or exaggerating the situation. But Jada didn't let those voices get to her. She was done with the silence. She met with Sandra, her lawyer, the following week to discuss the next steps. They sat across from each other in the firm's conference room, papers scattered between them. Sandra had always been professional, but there was a new intensity in her eyes now. We've filed. Now we need to prepare for a fight. The store will likely try to settle, but I think they'll drag this out as long as possible, Sandra said, flipping through a folder filled with case notes and evidence. We're up against a corporation, and they'll try to discredit you, make you seem like you're exaggerating or that this is just a misunderstanding. Jada nodded, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure she was. The thought of facing the store in court was daunting. But there was something inside her that refused to let this slide. She couldn't go back now. Over the next few weeks, Jada's life became a whirlwind of legal meetings, depositions, and media attention. The media took an almost voyeuristic interest in her story. She was no longer just a woman who had been wronged in a store. She was the face of a larger conversation about race and justice in America. Tom, the store manager, had been placed on administrative leave, and he kept a low profile. But Jada knew he was watching just as the store was watching. They weren't just trying to win the case, they were trying to bury her, to make her seem like she was the one in the wrong. The store's corporate response was calculated. They issued statements distancing themselves from Tom's actions. They apologized to Jada in the most impersonal way possible, claiming they had reviewed the incident internally and would implement new training for their staff. But Jada wasn't buying it. She had heard that same empty apology too many times. By now, she had received messages from people who had been in the store when the incident occurred. They confirmed what she had known all along. Tom had singled her out, had made assumptions about her based on her race. Some of the witnesses even came forward, willing to testify in her favor. These were the moments that made the whole thing feel real enough to push forward no matter the cost. One night, after a long day of interviews, Jada sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through the thousands of messages she had received. Some were supportive. Others were hateful, calling her a liar, accusing her of trying to ruin someone's life. The hate still stung, but she had learned to push it aside. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Sandra. "We've received an offer for a settlement. It's substantial, but they're still trying to silence you. They want you to sign a non-disclosure agreement. No public statement, no further action. Just take the money and go." Jada stared at the message, her heart racing. She knew this moment would come. The temptation of money, the promise of a quiet life, the chance to walk away without facing the relentless public scrutiny. It was tempting. It was so tempting. But Jada knew what this was. It was the same thing they always tried to do. Pay someone off and make them go away. Make them feel like it wasn't worth it. But Jada was no longer the person who would accept that. "Tell them no," Jada typed back, her fingers shaking as she hit send. "I'm not going anywhere." In the following weeks, Jada's resolve hardened. She began to see the case not just as a fight for her dignity, but as a fight for something much bigger. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to face what she had. The stories of others continued to flood in. People who had been subjected to similar treatment, who had walked away because they didn't know how to fight back. Now they were looking to her, and she couldn't let them down. The media coverage of the lawsuit grew, and soon Jada was being invited to speak on talk shows, to share her experiences with a broader audience. The response was overwhelming, and as she spoke, she began to realize just how much this had affected her. Not just the store, but the system that had allowed it to happen in the first place. But no matter how many stories she heard, no matter how many voices rallied behind her, there were always those who insisted this was an isolated incident. They told her that it was an exaggeration, that she was making a mountain out of a molehill. Some of them were even people she knew. Friends, acquaintances, people who had always seemed supportive, but who now found it easier to question her story than to confront the uncomfortable truth of the world around them. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was fighting for truth. And that was worth more than anything they could offer her. The settlement offer had been rejected, but the battle was far from over. The store, now at the center of a nationwide conversation about race and discrimination, was feeling the heat. They had underestimated Jada. They thought she would be silenced by a check, that she would take the easy way out. But she was still standing, stronger than ever. In the days following her rejection of the settlement, the store's corporate headquarters issued a statement in an attempt to quell the growing backlash. The company apologized for the misunderstanding with Jada and promised to conduct an internal review of their policies and procedures. They assured the public that they were committed to fostering a diverse, inclusive environment. But the apology was cold, calculated, and most of all, insincere. Jada sat in her lawyer's office, reading the company's statement, her eyes narrowing with disbelief. It was everything she had expected, worded carefully to avoid any real responsibility. She could feel the sting of their indifference in every line. "Committed to diversity," Sandra said, scoffing. "They're not fooling anyone with that." She leaned back in her chair, clearly frustrated. This is a classic corporate response. Make a half-hearted apology, say all the right things, and hope people forget about it. Jada looked at the statement again. The more she read it, the more it made her blood boil. The store had the audacity to say they were committed to diversity when the very man they employed had racially profiled her. They hadn't even directly addressed what had happened. They had tried to sweep it under the rug, to make it seem like a minor issue that could be fixed with a few polite words. "They want me to go away," Jada muttered, more to herself than to Sandra. "They want me to accept their apology, move on, and let them continue with business as usual." Sandra nodded. "They're hoping that if they say the right things, everyone will forget what happened. They'll move on and you'll move on." Jada stood up, her frustration building. "I won't be silenced. This isn't about an apology. It's about making sure they never do this again. It's about holding them accountable." Sandra gave her a small, approving smile. "That's why you're here. And why you need to keep pushing." The pressure from the public continued to mount on the store. Protests erupted outside locations across the country. Some were small, others massive, but each one sent a clear message. The store had failed and the people were watching. Social media was ablaze with hashtags supporting Jada, with people posting their own stories of similar discrimination. Her post, the one that had started it all, had gone viral, resharing and reposting faster than she could keep up with. Messages of support flooded her inbox, each one a reminder of why she had to keep going. But it wasn't all positive. The online backlash from some corners grew louder. The trolls, the doubters, the ones who refused to see what was happening, those voices grew louder too. "Why don't you just move on? Maybe you should have just complied. Why are you making such a big deal out of nothing?" Jada had been called all sorts of things. Some accused her of exaggerating the situation, while others suggested she was lying for attention. The hardest part wasn't the outright hate. It was the subtle doubt, the well-meaning people who couldn't quite see the full picture, who couldn't understand what it felt like to be a target of racial bias, to be seen as suspicious just by existing in certain spaces. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. A text from an unfamiliar number. "Jada, it's Marcus, the officer who was there that day." Jada frowned, her heart quickening. The officer who had stood by without intervening. She had almost forgotten about him. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have done more. I should have spoken up. I know I failed you that day and I can't change that. But I support you. Whatever you decide to do, I'm here." Jada sat down, reading the message over and over. She wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. Marcus had been a silent bystander, a part of the system that had allowed this to happen. But now, he was acknowledging his complicity. He was offering support in the only way he could. The apology wasn't enough. But it was something. Jada sat back, feeling the weight of the message. She wasn't sure if she could trust Marcus completely, but the small gesture felt like a step toward something. Something bigger than the legal battle, something about the possibility of change. Her phone rang, dragging her from her thoughts. Sandra again. Jada picked up, bracing herself for what was to come. "We have a meeting with the corporate representatives tomorrow," Sandra said, her tone serious. "It's time for them to answer for what they've done." Jada nodded, even though Sandra couldn't see her. She had known this was coming. The company was trying to placate her, to brush it all under the rug with a public meeting. They would apologize again, say the right things, but Jada wasn't fooling herself. They would try to offer a settlement again. They would try to make it go away. But this time, Jada wasn't going to let them. She stood, taking a deep breath as she stared out of the window. "I'm not leaving until they know this is bigger than just a check. I won't let them make it go away." Sandra was silent for a moment before replying, her voice steady. I know you won't. And that's why we're going to win this. Jada hung up and sat back down, her mind already racing ahead to tomorrow's meeting. This was it. The moment she had been preparing for. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. Tomorrow they would face her. And they would have to answer for everything. The meeting with the corporate representatives was set for the following afternoon, but Jada barely slept the night before. The weight of the impending confrontation sat heavily on her chest, a knot she couldn't shake. No matter how many times she told herself she was prepared, that this was the moment she'd been fighting for, the nerves wouldn't let up. The very idea of sitting across from the people who had dismissed her, who had refused to take responsibility, made her stomach churn. She arrived at the firm's office early, her lawyer, Sandra, already waiting for her. The firm's conference room felt more like a battlefield than a place of business. Large, cold, with walls that seemed to reflect the gravity of the moment. Sandra stood by the window, a folder of documents in hand. Her demeanor professional but tense. She looked over at Jada as she entered. Ready? Sandra asked, her voice calm but purposeful. Jada swallowed, nodding. She wasn't sure if she was ready. But she had no choice. It was time to face them. The representatives from the store arrived shortly after. They came in like a well-oiled machine. 3 suits, all polished smiles and rehearsed apologies. Their leader, a middle-aged man with perfectly combed hair and a stone-cold expression, shook Jada's hand with all the enthusiasm of a man who was already calculating his next move. His name was Richard, and he wasted no time in getting to the point. Jada, he began, his voice smooth. We want to start by saying that we deeply regret the situation you encountered in our store. It was never our intention to make you feel uncomfortable or unfairly targeted. We're here to listen to make things right. Jada wanted to laugh. It was the same empty words they had used in their public statement, just repackaged for the meeting. Nothing more than a facade, an attempt to soften the blow before making their next move. But she held her ground, her gaze steady. You don't get to apologize and move on. You don't get to pretend like this wasn't a systemic issue. This isn't about making me feel comfortable. This is about what you've done to countless other people. What you've done to me. Richard's expression tightened, but he didn't break eye contact. We understand that, and we're committed to making changes. We've already begun implementing diversity training across our stores. We've also reviewed our policies to ensure something like this doesn't happen again. Jada's heart pounded in her chest. The rehearsed words were almost worse than silence. This wasn't an apology. This wasn't accountability. This was damage control. Sandra spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Mr. Richards, with all due respect, we're not here for training seminars and policies that are just smoke and mirrors. Jada was profiled in your store. She was treated as a criminal based on her race. And that's not something a few diversity workshops can fix. Richard opened his mouth to protest, but Sandra held up a hand, continuing. What we're asking for is more than a settlement. Jada is seeking justice. Not just for herself, but for every other person who's been wronged by this store and its practices. We're demanding that you publicly acknowledge your role in this, that you take real action, not just lip service. The room fell silent for a moment. Jada could see Richard's eyes flicker. He hadn't expected Sandra to come out swinging. He had thought this meeting would go smoothly, that he could placate them and get away with the same weak promises. Well, Jada, Richard said after a beat, his voice more measured now, we're willing to offer a compensation package, a financial settlement, along with a public apology. Jada didn't flinch. She had known this was coming, but it still felt like a slap in the face. I'm not interested in money, she said, her voice cold. I want to see real change. I want to see this company held accountable for the culture you've fostered. I want policies that address the systematic discrimination that continues to happen in your stores, that addresses the culture of profiling that allows people like me to be treated this way. Sandra nodded, adding, We've already prepared a legal strategy to ensure that those changes are mandatory. This isn't something we can just talk about. This is something you will be legally required to implement. If that's not on the table, we'll see you in court. Richard's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping the edge of the table as he processed the situation. He had expected Jada to be a simple case, someone looking for a quick payout, someone who could be brushed aside. But this wasn't going to be that easy. Finally, he sighed, as if resigning himself to a battle he wasn't sure he was going to win. "All right, Jada," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll review our position and get back to you. But we're going to need time to make these kinds of changes." "No more time," Jada snapped, her voice sharp. "The time for change was yesterday. You've had time. It's been months, and we're still at square one." Sandra gave Jada an approving look, and Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Then we'll have no choice but to proceed," Sandra said firmly. "And rest assured, you'll be hearing from us soon." As they left the conference room, Jada felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction. She had said her piece. She had demanded more than just an apology, more than just a settlement. She had demanded change, and she wasn't going to back down until she got it. But she knew this wasn't over. The battle was just beginning. The store would drag this out, try to avoid responsibility, and make her fight for every inch of progress. But Jada was ready. She had come this far. She wasn't going to stop now. And as she walked out of the office, heading back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to shift. The store, Tom, the system, they had underestimated her. And now they would have to face the consequences. Jada stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, the weight of the day settling into her bones. Her eyes were tired, her shoulders heavy with the tension of the last few weeks. The meeting with the store's representatives had been hard, an emotional and exhausting confrontation, one that made her feel both victorious and drained. She had stood firm, demanding the accountability she knew was long overdue, but the fight was far from over. She splashed water on her face, letting the coolness wash over her. She needed to stay focused. She couldn't afford to let the toll of the battle break her. Not now. Not when she was so close. The phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She grabbed it, expecting another message from Sandra or perhaps a follow-up from the news outlets covering her case. But it wasn't either of those. It was a notification from her social media, another wave of messages flooding in. Her heart sank as she scrolled through them. Some of the messages were supportive, of course. People continued to praise her courage, telling her how proud they were of her for standing up. But there were others, dozens of others, that made her stomach twist in knots. Racist comments, accusations that she was fabricating the story, playing the victim for attention. People who questioned why she hadn't just left the store, why she hadn't cooperated with the police. Some even blamed her for the store's supposed ruin, as if this was all some elaborate scheme she had orchestrated just to get back at a store. Jada clenched her jaw, the sting of the hateful messages hitting harder than she wanted to admit. It wasn't the first time she'd faced this kind of backlash, but this was different. This was public. This was loud. People she didn't even know were dissecting her every move, scrutinizing her every word. It wasn't just about me, she thought bitterly. It's about everything I represent to them. Every stereotype they've been taught to believe. She had become a symbol, a target for both sides of the issue. The support felt empowering, but the hate, that was suffocating. It made her question herself in ways she hadn't anticipated. Was she too vocal? Was she pushing too hard? Could she have handled it better? She shook her head, trying to dispel the doubts, but they lingered, hovering just beneath the surface. She had always known the risk of going public with her story, but she had hoped it would be different. That the truth would win out, that people would see through the prejudice and stand with her. Instead, she was caught in a battle of perception, a battle that was about far more than just her personal experience. The next few days felt like an emotional roller coaster. Every time Jada opened her social media, there was a new flood of comments, a new round of arguments. The noise was deafening, but there were small moments that kept her going. A message from a stranger in another city, telling her how they'd experienced something similar. A post from an activist she admired, commending her for her courage. These small victories kept her grounded, even when everything else seemed overwhelming. But the most important thing was what was happening behind the scenes. The legal process was moving forward, and despite the noise, things were starting to shift. The store had agreed to mediation, but they were still dragging their feet, refusing to commit to meaningful change. They had made a few empty promises, but Jada wasn't fooled. She knew their goal was to end things quietly, to pay her off and bury the story. That wasn't enough for her. She wasn't here for a quick payout. She was here to make sure this didn't happen again. Sandra had told her they were gathering more evidence, reaching out to other potential witnesses who had experienced discrimination in the store. But Jada knew this process would take time. They would drag it out. They would use every trick they had to discredit her and her story. It didn't matter. Jada wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, as Jada sat in her living room, reviewing her notes for the next round of legal preparations, she heard a knock on her door. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, she found a young woman standing on her doorstep. She was holding a small notebook in her hand, looking nervous but determined. "Jada?" the woman asked softly, her voice shaking slightly. Jada raised an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued. "Yes. I saw your story on the news," the woman continued. "And I just wanted to say, you're not alone. I've been through the same thing. I work at that store, the one you're suing." Jada's heart skipped a beat. She stepped back, allowing the woman inside. "You work there?" she asked, trying to process the sudden turn of events. The woman nodded, glancing nervously around. "I'm sorry, I didn't know how to reach out, but I had to tell you. What happened to you was wrong. I've seen it happen before. And I've been too scared to say anything, but I can't stay quiet anymore." Jada's eyes widened. She motioned for the woman to sit down. "You've seen it happen. What kind of things?" The woman took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "I've seen managers make assumptions about customers, treat them differently based on how they look. It's happened so many times, but I've been too afraid to speak out. I didn't want to lose my job." Jada listened intently as the woman explained, sharing stories of incidents that mirrored what had happened to her. She could hear the guilt in her voice, the weight of being complicit in a system that perpetuated racial bias. But the fact that she was speaking up now, finally after all this time, meant something. It meant there were people in that store who knew the truth, who had witnessed the injustice and had been too scared to say anything. "Why now?" Jada asked gently. "What changed?" The woman swallowed hard, her eyes filling with tears. "You changed everything. You made me believe that it's possible to stand up and be heard. I don't want to be silent anymore. I'm ready to testify. I'm ready to help." Jada's chest tightened with emotion. She hadn't expected this. Hadn't expected someone from within the store to come forward like this. It felt like a turning point, like the walls were starting to crumble. For the first time, she saw the possibility of something real happening. She took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're helping more than you know." As the woman left, Jada felt a renewed sense of determination. The store's days of hiding behind empty apologies and corporate statements were numbered. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been silenced. And with every new voice, every new ally, the weight of the system began to shift. Jada knew the fight wasn't over yet. But this was her moment, a moment that felt like it was finally within reach. The courtroom was quiet. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation, as the judge entered the room. Jada took a deep breath, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. The weight of everything, the months of public scrutiny, the legal battles, the endless support and the hateful backlash, had led to this moment. She had been through hell and back, but she wasn't alone anymore. Sandra sat beside her, flipping through her notes one last time, while the opposing lawyer for the store, Richard, shuffled his papers across the table. He was confident, his demeanor smooth and practiced, As if this were just another case to him. Jada could see right through it. This wasn't just any case. This was about much more than money or a simple apology. This was about justice. And for once, the truth seemed to be on her side. Jada had heard it all. The store's defense had been relentless, asserting that Tom's actions were an isolated mistake, that their policies were already in place to address such issues, and that they were committed to making improvements. But every word felt like a hollow promise, a bandage on a wound too deep to heal with corporate jargon. The trial had dragged on for weeks, but now it was coming to a close. All the evidence had been presented, the recordings, the witnesses, the documents that painted a clear picture of a culture of bias within the store. Tom had even been called to testify, and his lies had unraveled quickly. He had claimed he didn't remember calling the police, that he had acted out of an abundance of caution. But the footage of the phone call told a different story, one of deliberate profiling and racial bias. Jada's heart pounded as the closing arguments began. Sandra rose from her chair, moving to the center of the courtroom. She was a force to be reckoned with, her presence commanding attention as she began her statement. This case is not just about one woman being treated unfairly. It's about a pattern of behavior, one that has been ignored and excused for far too long. It's about a system that allows people to be treated as criminals based solely on their appearance, based solely on the color of their skin. She paused, letting the words settle in. The room was still, the air thick with tension. Sandra's voice rang out, unwavering. Jada deserves more than just an apology. She deserves justice. She deserves to be heard, to be validated, to know that her experience matters. And she is not the only one. There are countless others who have been silenced, who have been pushed aside, who have been treated like criminals because of the prejudices that have been allowed to fester in places like this store. Sandra turned and gestured toward the defense table, her gaze hard and unyielding. The store would like you to believe that what happened to Jada was an anomaly. But we know that's not true. We know that systemic racism exists, and it thrives in the places where we shop, where we work, where we live. This court has the power to make sure that this doesn't happen again. To send a message that this behavior will not be tolerated, and that accountability matters. Jada's throat tightened. She had heard Sandra speak before, many times, but something about the way she spoke now, with such conviction and clarity, struck a chord deep inside her. This was it. This was the moment. This was what she had been fighting for all along. As Sandra finished her statement, the room went quiet. The judge took a moment to review his notes, the final decision looming. Jada's hands were shaking now, but she kept her composure, taking deep breaths as she focused on the sound of the judge's pen scratching against the paper. Finally, the judge looked up, his voice steady as he addressed the court. After reviewing all evidence presented and considering the impact of this case, I find in favor of the plaintiff. Jada's breath caught in her chest. The words seemed to echo, each one like a hammer strike of finality. In favor of the plaintiff. The judge continued, outlining the verdict. The store would be required to pay damages to Jada for emotional distress, as well as provide mandatory anti-racism training for all employees. The store's corporate leadership would have to issue a public apology, not the kind they had given before, but one that acknowledged the systematic failures within their company and pledged real action to address the problem. Jada felt a rush of emotion, a mixture of relief and triumph. This wasn't just a legal victory. This was something much bigger. This was proof that the system could change, that accountability could be demanded, and that voices like hers mattered. As Jada left the courtroom, her lawyer Sandra by her side, the weight of the moment slowly began to settle. It wasn't the end of her journey, not yet. There would be more battles to fight, more systems to confront. But for the first time in a long while, Jada felt a sense of peace. She had stood her ground, and now the world would have to listen. Outside the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the steps. Jada paused, taking a deep breath of fresh air. For a moment, everything felt still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. And then in the distance she heard it. A small cheer, then another and another. People had gathered outside, witnesses to the victory that was unfolding. The protesters, the supporters, the people who had been silently watching and hoping for change. They had seen what Jada had done, and now they were showing their support. Jada turned to Sandra, her heart swelling with emotion. "We did it," she said, her voice thick with tears. Sandra smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "No, Jada. You did it." Jada's lips parted, a smile tugging at her mouth as she looked out at the crowd. She wasn't alone anymore. She had started something that couldn't be undone. And for the first time, she could breathe without the weight of fear or uncertainty pressing down on her. This was just the beginning. And as she walked down the steps of the courthouse, the cheers growing louder around her, Jada knew that her fight had made a difference. The world had changed a little that day. Maybe not for everyone, but for her, for the people who had stood by her, and for the countless others whose voices had been silenced. It wasn't over, but it was a victory. A hard-won, long-overdue victory. And Jada would make sure it counted.